Welcome, aviators, to another Motivation Monday. I'm happy to be here today. We've got a lot of great questions that seem to set themselves apart from some of the other Motivation Mondays that we've done. We had a very active live feed that we do each week here on Instagram where people ask questions live. Of course, those are tuned into this YouTube video that you're seeing now or the podcast that you're listening to. You can find my YouTube channel, Angle of Attack. Just search it. You'll see a little orange aviator icon. And then, of course, the podcast is called Aviator Cast. You can get that on iTunes or Spotify, or the top two, and then trickles down from there to pretty much anywhere you want to find the podcast, you can find it. You can also find everything at angleofattack.com on our blog and lots of resources here. So this is an opportunity to answer your flight training and aviation career questions. There are many of them. There's a lot of variety. This is the 9th one of these I've done, so I'm getting really used to answering these questions on the fly and just really helpful. The best thing to do is to go to YouTube. There is a description there that is searchable, so you'll see the questions lined out, and then you'll be able to click on the time code, and that will jump you straight to the answer for that question. So that's really helpful for you. You don't necessarily have to listen to this front to back, but it's a good location to go to. If you're on YouTube, make sure that you like this, you subscribe, you turn on notification bells so you can get resources like this when they come live. And if you are listening to the podcast, of course, subscribe. Really appreciate you guys also being part of the community. I'm not just here to throw stuff out and not talk to you guys. I'm here to actually share and learn from you as well and interact with you one-on-one. That's what I am all about. So, comment on YouTube. Send me an email about how you like the podcast. Send me a direct message on Instagram, whatever it is. Be part of this community. I love to hear from you guys. All right? So thanks for being here, and let's dive right into the questions. Advice for commercial maneuver mastery. So thanks, Nicole. Good to hear from you. I follow Nicole on Instagram. She's working through some of her ratings. So the commercial license is all about precision and performance when it comes to the maneuvers. So that is going to be what you're learning. And I would suggest that you get a really good feel for how to fly the airplane by instinct. That is what the different maneuvers that you are going to be doing in commercial are going to require of you. Things like 8s on pylons. You're almost always staring out the window on 8s on pylons. You're not adjusting power or anything. Of course, you do need to spread your attention to making sure you're staying away from other traffic. And then you're looking at that spot and adjusting your altitude based on how your ground speed is changing with the wind. So I usually feel it just in my fingertips, and I'm pulling back a little if I see it moving away, push forward, whatever it is, and I smoothly try to see those changes on that target on my wing and change those that pivotal altitude as I'm going through that maneuver. Of course, we have the chandelles, which are a combat turn is what it used to be called. Basically, you're coming up behind your enemy, high performance. It is a practical maneuver for maybe getting out of something like a canyon or having to turn around, something of that nature. Got lazy 8s, which teaches you about the overbanking tendency in the airplane and just letting it naturally fly. A bunch of different stuff. So the biggest one I like in commercial training is the power off 180. And that takes a lot of instinct, a lot of understanding the energy left in the airplane. And so really my advice on this is simply practice, 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 and realize that it is a matter of instinct. You should have a good number of hours by now since the minimum is 250. So just trust your inner spidey sense, aviator sense, and go with that. So that is how to get after the commercial maneuver mastery. And don't feel bashful about going out and just practicing on your own. When I did my commercial, I remember being at an airport and doing like 40 power off 180s at this controlled airport is in Ogden, Utah. And I just nailing a ton of them, and I got such a good feel for the airplane. So that's my advice on commercial maneuver mastery. All right, so good question, Nicole. Thanks for that. Hope you're doing well. Are you allowed to fly an instrument approach at a controlled field with a non-IFR rated safety pilot on a VFR day? I don't see why not. I mean, a safety pilot doesn't have to be instrument rated for you to fly with them. They are simply there to look for traffic and make sure that you're basically keeping things under control. So absolutely, you could do it at a controlled field with a non-IFR rated safety pilot. I don't see why not. Maybe I'm missing something there, but you should absolutely be able to do that. They will learn something along the way, and so on and so forth. So yep, definitely go for that. And you all can learn something along the way and both build that PIC time. So that should work just great. Tips on establishing personal minimums. What are yours? So personal minimums are essentially minimums that are different from the regulatory minimums. So we know that if you're in pilot training or you're a pilot, you know that there are minimums for clouds and visibility based on certain airspaces and different times of day. So that is the bare minimum, right? But then a lot of pilots end up getting personal minimums that are higher than that based on their personal experience and the things they are willing to do and aren't willing to do. It doesn't all have to do with clouds and visibility. Some of it has to do with how much you fly in a day, how much crosswind you want to deal with and land with, et cetera, on down the list. The FAA has a really good publication on this to figure out your own personal minimums, and I would go through and use that worksheet and set your personal minimums. Another good tip that I learned from my friend Jason Miller of the Finer Points is that he never changes his personal minimums on the day of the flight. And that makes sure that you are not adjusting your minimums to fit some flight that you want to push yourself to do. So keep that in mind as well. But go there and set those minimums and then stick to them, and you will be a safer pilot for it. As you get more experience, you can work down those minimums over time. So that's just a great way to do it. Just go do it. Find that FAA publication and go through it, okay? Planning on coming to Cape Fear Aviation this summer to fly with Dave. I'm not planning on coming this summer to fly with Dave, but hopefully I'll be there in the future. I was maybe thinking next winter about this time that I would come to Cape Fear and fly with you guys there. Okay, here's a good one. One that we get almost weekly, but I definitely have to get into it and answer it. So advice for private pilot, oral and practical. So this is actually talking about the check ride, and many of you have already taken a check ride or you've heard of the check ride, and it composes of two different parts. The first part is a oral examination, which is essentially a conversation with the DPE, designated pilot examiner, where you will go through and have a discussion about what you know in aviation. Of course, you would have already passed your written test, so you've already shown that you know quite a bit of knowledge in aviation. But now that person, that DPE, wants to test you on essentially your ability to think critically about the aspects of flight and applying that knowledge to the real world. This is a discussion. It's not an interrogation. It's not something where they ask you a question and you have to answer perfectly, and if you don't, then you fail. It's a discussion about how your mind works and how you work through these problems when you're trying to do things safely in aviation. So my advice there is to calm down, have the conversation, explain what you know, share examples that you've learned so far about that, and just share how you would go through it. The practical is almost a formality. You should have already gone through with your instructor many times and done it. Just keep it moving, and if the DPE says move on to the next thing and asks you to do something else, it means you've done just fine, even if you think you haven't. So just keep it moving. I share a lot of advice in my online course on Check Ride ACE. So I have Check Ride ACE for private, instrument, and commercial, and that will take you through the entire process. I have a Check Ride checklist along with that, which is all the materials you need to bring and how to organize it. And the best part is the study guide, which is a fill-in-the-blank study guide on the knowledge you need to polish up on for your oral exam. And that's going to help you tremendously in your check ride. You guys can go check that out at checkrideace.com and see if it'll work for you. And I think it's really great. People have really been liking it so far. And yeah, go check it out. Okay, here's a good question. Yeah, I like this question. Okay. Because it allows me to share a story. Has there ever been a time where you demonstrated poor ADM? What happened? What did you learn from it? I think that everyone that gets a license, especially if you're young, you have some poor aeronautical decision making in the very beginning. Not that it's like inherently obvious or that it's all the time, But there are just going to be times where you learned something from maybe pushing yourself too hard. So I did have a handful of scenarios where I pushed myself too hard. They are things that I wouldn't do again. Of course, when I was younger and I had a lot more energy, I felt like I could fly longer and I could get to the point of fatigue. I think for us pilots, we're always kind of skating the edge of poor versus good aeronautical decision making. Because one could say that good aeronautical decision making is never doing anything risky at all and always just doing what is the most safest thing. And in aviation, there is a balance between risk and reward, just as many things in life. So if you were very, very safe in your aeronautical decision making, you may not ever get anywhere. You may not ever go anywhere. And I think that in and of itself lends to a bit of a hazard in the sense that you don't end up growing as a pilot if you aren't out there trying new things. And that balance between that, kind of being on that line of growing and trying new things, but also not being in a position where you are forced to make poor decisions is pretty thin. That's a thin line. And so I think I still skate that line of poor aeronautical decision making where I'm just trying to see, okay, yes, I'm here. I have some confidence in my skills. I have a good handful of hours that I am drawing my experience from, but let me not lean on that too much. What are the things that could get in the way this flight that could cross me over from that good aeronautical decision making to get to this point over to the poor aeronautical decision making? So that means that at some point, if things deteriorate and it's just not working anymore, it's time to draw back and stop and do something different, and break that chain of events that so often leads to an accident or an incident. So I think that, I could share the precise examples that I've had. I can think of a handful of them that I'm not necessarily proud of. And I think every pilot is that way. We learn fairly early on, again, just to phrase it a little bit differently, that we do, in fact, have hazardous attitudes and we are susceptible to making poor decisions. And it's just helped me realize even more that I need to be humble. And even with my experience, that if nothing else, my experience actually lends to me making those better decisions than me saying, "Ooh, I got away with that before, let me do it again." I think I more lean toward the side of I shouldn't have been that close to that situation and I want to do things differently in the future. So I continue to learn more about my limitations, and I think that's the message I want to send across in that question and answer, rather than simply saying, "Hey, here's a cool story of something dumb I did one time." I think we got to look at that thin line and understand what side of the line we want to be on and continually try to adjust our decisions to make sure that we stay on that good side of the ADM or aeronautical decision making line. So great question. Thanks for that. Universities that offer an aviation pathway or a flight school. Gosh, the list is hundreds of flight schools long, hundreds of universities long. There are very many of them. Even if you go to, gosh, there are just so many. Even if you went to like the vendors at Oshkosh and saw the universities that are there, you're going to see many of them. My suggestion there, if you are going to go to a university, is, this is just a personal preference, but I would not go to the biggest school. I would not go to the busiest school. I would not go to the school with the biggest marketing budget that really reels you in. I would go to a place where it's more affordable. Maybe the vocation of that school isn't centered around aviation. Maybe it's something else, but you can get better, more personal attention at that school and do so cheaper, because there are aviation universities that are hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I think that's really unnecessary when it comes to building your experience. So just think of it that way. Think of not the best, but what is the best for me and what is the best for my future finances. There are so many aviation universities out there. Finally did my solo flight. I'm about 7K in my lessons, maybe 30 hours, and I have done one cross country. How do I keep on track? How do I keep my costs down? I'm gonna think that this is going the how do I keep my costs down direction. It's cut off, so I can't see the rest of the question. The best way to keep your costs down when you feel like you have maybe taken longer to progress than some students, which is totally fine. Everyone learns at a different pace. The best way to keep your costs down is the home study that you can put in, the work that you put in at home rather than in the airplane. When you're in the airplane with your instructor, you're paying your instructor, you're paying for the airplane. It is a very, very, very expensive and, in fact, ineffective classroom. The airplane should be the verification point of a lot of the knowledge and the theoretical skills that you're trying to build. And that should be the last place you're really trying to learn. There, it's more about the muscle memory and kind of finalizing all that. Of course, there's plenty that goes into it. That's easier said than done because it is difficult to learn how to land. You got to learn how the airplane moves about the sky, and you've got to learn how to do that with your own muscle memory, with your, literally like how much pressure it takes and so on and so forth. So that's really important. But the home study, I can't overemphasize enough. Those of my students that have done the best have been those that were very disciplined in working on their study at home. Those that knew it would take 3 hours of ground time at home study time for every 1 hour of flight. Those are the students I've had that passed the minimum amount of hours and have just done very, very well. So if you are wanting to save money, if you're wanting to be really effective in your training, that is the best way. It is largely entirely up to you to do so. So that's how you need to build your training plan. Now, all of that said, you're 30 hours in. That's more than normal for the solo time. In fact, I'm not even going to say it's more than normal. I think actually 30 hours to solo is probably average for those that are recreational pilots, okay? If you're younger and you're going through training, it's above average. But anyway, so you're deeper into it and you just soloed. No big deal, okay? Don't feel like you are flawed in any sort of way. If anything, I find that a lot of times people that take longer on stuff like this, they just have to find out what works in a different way. And when that light bulb goes on, sometimes they can be a much more powerful student and understand what is going on to a greater extent than those that just had it easy. So don't discount your experience so far. It's worth something, and keep going at it. Stay positive and keep moving forward. Okay, so this is a question kind of based on a podcast I just did, and so actually I'm just going to point you toward that podcast. Becoming an aviation professional, not just a PPL in commercial training. So I really like the term professional when it comes to aviation training, because I think there are all different levels of flight training that you can receive out there in the world, okay? There's just anyone just teaching you to fly and not having really anything official to do, not learning how to talk on the radio well, not learning airspace well, but just going out with a buddy and kind of learning how to fly a plane, okay? That's one way of doing it, which isn't a great way. And then there's the extreme other end, which is the very regimented, math-heavy, procedural-heavy, airline way of doing it. And I like to be like 2/3 toward the airline way of doing it. I want my students to have a really deep knowledge of their aircraft. I want them to know about the air traffic system. I want them to know about the aerodynamics of their airplane. I want them to be great procedurally. I want them to instinctually be able to fly the airplane. So I think that there's a balance we have to find, more so on the professional side, where we are mixing the knowledge that is required in aviation, which is quite a bit if you're doing it right, and the skills required in aviation too, and learning how those mix in what we call, and have already brought up, aeronautical decision making, and becoming someone that can make good decisions. So I think that sense of professionalism and building that sense of professionalism from the private pilot level all the way up, even if you aren't planning on becoming a quote-unquote professional, is very, very important. And those habits that you build early on in your training will stick with you for the rest of your life. There are still so many things that are habits that I have from the very beginning of hours of my training that I have today. and some things that I didn't build a habit in that are very difficult to build a better and new habit in. So try to do it right the first time, and encourage your instructor, and really set yourself up, not just for your instructor, but set yourself up in a place where you're going to get the best training, the best bang for your buck. How long did it take me to get my private pilot license? It was, let's see, it was about 6 months to get my private pilot license. Now, I was admittedly like skipping class at college and going flying and really focusing on it. And then there were about 3 months in there where the airport was completely socked in with weather. So I got my license on March 13th, 2004. March 13th, 2004. So quite a while ago, but not too long ago. And yep. So that's my story. Got it pretty minimum hours, but I don't know. I think everyone has their own story. You write your own story. Of course, we have common threads we can share with each other, but the mark of how quickly you get it done doesn't necessarily show the mark of professionalism that you have. Again, I think that's largely based on the study that you have. I was so enamored and passionate about aviation. It was like the first study and subject that I had in my life that I could just absorb like crazy and not get bored. And so I just consumed for several years and was very prepared for my training. So yeah. I really liked this question when I saw it come across. I'm going for my instrument rating. What can I do at home, the car, the road to practice? This is a great question because going back to my college days when I was working on my private pilot license, I would travel home some weekends to see my girlfriend, and it was about a 2.5 hour drive to get home to see her. And I remember driving down the road, and I would follow the center line on the highway in the middle of the night. So I'd kind of be tired, and I'd be, driving, and I'd notice all of a sudden that I was using the center line rather than an actual lane to move down the road. But another thing I would do to keep myself awake because I was moving down the road, and this can actually help you with your IFR communications, is I would try to read off the road signs, especially on the highway. I try to read each letter of like the exit before I pass that sign. So it just helped with the muscle memory and the exercising of my tongue to say, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, so on and so forth, as I went down, naming that stuff off, and even naming off maybe the numbers as well. So just rattling it off really fast really helped me. I think there are other things that in driving that help us as well. One thing I try to do is I try to anticipate when I would need to kick off my cruise control to let it slow down, so that I got to a point where I wasn't just slamming on the brakes at a light, but I was like anticipating how much energy was left in my vehicle to actually stop. Also, driving and being really precise with the number on my speedometer was fun. I don't know. I think there are lots of things we can actually do in the car that can help us to be better pilots. It's a subject that I've considered doing as a podcast because I think we can sit there and actually do quite a bit. And definitely I think, above and beyond everything else, even though pilots are typically, I think, a lot smarter than your typical everyday driver, at least more conscientious, I am big about being a defensive driver and seeing potential hazards come. So I try to be very aware about my surroundings and drive defensively. And I think that we need to fly defensively as well, because it is much more dangerous in a traffic pattern than it is on the highway. I'm not even going to compare the statistics. I don't know what they are, but I just know that the consequences are much more grave in the air if I was to hit somebody, okay? So I am very, very conscious about that and my surroundings and where people are and how they're moving, and that's another thing I do too. So anyway, lots of different things that you can do in a car. Get creative about it. It's pretty fun to do. Okay, this is a question that came across. As a CFI, how would you advise a student to tell their instructor about mistakes made soloing? So I think that for me, with my students, they are going to go out into their cross countries and their solo flights or whatever it is, and they're going to make a number of mistakes. I'm not going to be there right over their shoulder. I'm not going to film that flight necessarily. I might do it for content or something, but I'm not going to sit there and scrutinize every little thing that they did, because really the point of a solo flight is for them to be totally on their own. They should have the training and knowledge to handle it already. Of course, you're going to feel very apprehensive when you first start that process, and that's going to be a little bit different. But I just want my students to build confidence from that experience. Now, there are going to be things that they do incorrectly and they do wrong and they get confused on. And so I have just a get out of jail free card mentality that, I'm not going to reprimand them for anything when they get back. We are going to talk seriously about what they faced, the problems they faced, and discuss through those. I've never really had anything that's bad that's come out of a student going solo cross country. I had a student, in fact, that went to their third destination on a cross country, and the winds were too crazy for them. So instead of landing there, they went around and they came back. They made a fantastic decision. So I like to talk through the scenarios about what they actually went through, but let them do the self-evaluation instead of me nitpicking at what they did and, getting them in trouble or reprimanding them. It's more about them sharing it in kind of a safe way where I'm not going to come down on them for that. So there you go. That's what I want from them, and then we can talk about it from there and grow from there. And really, it's the start of that experience of them experiencing that in the real world, because I still experience that in the real world. I learn something from every single flight. Even as a licensed pilot, I'm still not great at crosswind landings. What's the best way to improve? The number one way to improve is to actually go out there and do it. You can go with an instructor, absolutely, when you know that the winds are going to be a little crazy, and just go in it. As long as they're not too strong, you're not going to hurt anything. You're not going to be in danger in any way. But until you actually go out there and you try it and you do it, you can't build that confidence. So it's really a matter of going out there and making it happen. You need to realize two things about crosswind landings, though, okay? What we're trying to do is we're trying to keep the airplane headed straight down the runway while still having this force acting upon us. So it becomes a little bit tricky because, of course, we crab down into the wind, moving toward the runway, right? We crab into the wind, but at that last second, we need to align with the wind. And if all we do is, or align with the runway, if all we do is align with the runway, well, then we have the wind pushing us, and so we need to correct with aileron into the wind. That allows us to prevent that drift from side to side, and then the longitudinal direction of the airplane, basically aligning tip to tail with the center line, is controlled with the rudder. So finding the perfect combination there is really what you're looking for, and it's one thing to talk about that in theory, but it's a completely different thing to go out there and do it in the real world. Now, one thing I would challenge you guys to do is realize that a lot of the landings that you're already doing are crosswind landings, at least a little bit. And so be really conscious about where your aircraft is when you're coming down, even if it's just a tiny little crab, and getting familiar with what corrections it takes to actually land on center line without that side drift, and with the aircraft being aligned from tip to tail down that center line. So those are the things you need to work on, but you can't actually do it unless you go out and try it. And so get an instructor that is willing to do that with you and say, hey, here's what I want to do at a moment's notice. Would you be down with going up with me and flying in crosswind so I can get used to it? I think that's a perfectly healthy thing to do as a pilot. You don't need to be in active private pilot training or anything else to ask an instructor to fly with you. I think that's a misconception we need to go away from, okay? You don't have to be in active pilot training to fly with an instructor. They are perfectly willing and capable and able to go up with you to add more to your experience between licenses or just because you want to. So keep that in mind. Thanks for the great question there, Nick. That was thought-provoking. Advice for chair flying. Do you use chair flying? And all I'm going to do on this question is I'm going to refer you to last week, because there was a question about chair flying last week on Motivation Monday as well. So you can find the previous sessions of Motivation Monday on YouTube or on the podcast. YouTube is super convenient because you can actually look in the description and find the question that you want to know more about, something that's applicable to your current state in flight training or your career, and click on the time code. It'll take you directly to that question. So it's really, really helpful. I answered this on last week's podcast and Motivation Monday, so go check that out. I felt like it was a good answer, so I don't necessarily want to answer it again. Thoughts on training in a Cirrus SR20 for a private pilot? I'm not a huge fan. You know, the Cirrus I kind of consider to be a sports car in a way, and if I was to use a sports car to do my initial driving, then I would have been in a hot mess, and I would have been behind a lot. So I think the SR20 is maybe a little bit different in the sense that it isn't, an SR22 GT turbo, whatever the heck. So it's a little bit different, but it still is a very nice airplane and a sports car in a sense. So I'm not a huge fan of that idea. I like smaller airplanes to start, but it just depends. If you have the situation that affords you that, and that's what you want to do, that can happen. It might just take you longer to go through your training. That's totally fine. So it just depends. What is your opinion on using cameras in the cockpit for flight review for the private pilot license? I think, I'm a huge proponent of video. You guys have seen my YouTube channel. You've seen here on Instagram, I use video a lot. I think to use it in an official capacity where a student is using it to review their flights is a really great thing to do. There's a little bit of technical stuff to get past, like how you get the card and download it and review it with the audio that you have to get past in setting it up, and realize that it can't become a distraction in the flight training. But to be able to review that flight after hours or between flights without the mental exercise of you flying the airplane and learning so many new things, you can retain so much more about your flight training if you can do something like this to review your flights. The one camera position I would suggest is behind your head, where you can see the instrument panel and see how your instructor is talking to you. I think that's going to be the most helpful. And that is that's a fantastic way for you to absorb your flight training even more. Not everyone can do that, but I definitely suggest it if you can. It'll just make you that much better. I hate to talk about flight school specifically, but this is something that a lot of people go after, so let me just share a couple thoughts on it. How do you feel about ATP as a school as far as building hours? Do you think it's best to piece it out, CFI, et cetera, or going to maybe the full thing? Yeah, someone said dicey question in the comments. So here's the thing. I talked earlier about different forms of flight training and how you can just go to a mom and pop or with a friend and get it done, or the fully professional way of going the airline way. And the way ATP does it, which I'm not going to say is wrong, there are very few things in aviation that are right and wrong. There are different ways of thinking and different opinions, and even in terms of how lift works and what the control surfaces do, there's even some disagreement. So, I'm really careful not to have absolutes in aviation. When it comes to ATP, here's their thing, okay? ATP is saying, at the end of the day, they're a business. They have great business relationships with banks. Those banks can offer loans, and those loans are at a very high amount for what you're getting, and you're going to go through your training quickly and get it all done, and you're going to have the same rating as everyone else, okay? That is the ATP way. It's minimum output of their school for maximum amount of money. That is what they do. It's a good business model, and they have financing, which is very attractive for people, because getting financing for flight training is very, very difficult. So they have a good model. And I know some great pilots that went to ATP. Not every ATP school is the same. They each have kind of their culture. Some are bad, some are good, just like other flight schools. So it kind of depends. It really depends on the instructors at the end of the day. But you aren't getting a very in-depth type of flight training like you would from a guy that's been doing it for 30 years, okay? You are going to get the minimum required to get the license done and move on. So that's the way it is. You end up in the same location. It works for some people, not for others. It just depends. So it's not to say that they're bad and wrong or anything. I think they do a lot of things right. I wish that for my flight school I had the option of financing people, but I don't. And so they have that in their corner. So it just depends. Really just depends. And I just caution you to look more at other flight schools, different options, scholarships, et cetera, et cetera. Be prudent with your money. Don't just put your name on the line for gigantic loans with a university or a flight school because you think they're the absolute best and the only way to do it. Research a lot and ask the questions, and this is you asking the questions, so I really appreciate you doing that. What is the average time to get your instrument rating? The instrument rating is a rating I don't think that anyone should rush, if at all possible. Of course, we just talked about ATP. 141 programs typically send you through at the bare minimum and get you done, and you don't necessarily get a lot of real-world experience when you're doing your instrument rating. The way I did mine is first and foremost, I failed my first instrument check ride. I tried to do one of those 10-day accelerated instrument courses, and it did not go well at all. It wasn't in-depth training. It wasn't quality training, and came out the other side confused and not really knowing how everything fit together. Yeah, I could fly an approach, and I could go through some of the motions, but I was never going to go out and do the actual thing. So I took a step back and really asked myself if I needed to be doing the instrument rating right now if I didn't really understand it. And I felt like I didn't. And so I didn't even try to retake the one part of my check ride I needed to do. Rather, what I did is I waited a few years until some other things had changed. And I went in knowing I was only going to take my check ride and be ready for my instrument check ride when I was confident that I could leave from that check ride and actually use my license. And so what I did is I went with my instructor. There are many schools you could do this with. I went with my instructor for 3 days, and we went to the Oregon coast, Washington area as well, and we did instrument flying in the clouds, down the minimums for 3 days, and did the real thing. And I learned so quickly the lessons and why they matter during that process, and just enjoyed it so much. And my instrument check ride was very easy. I was just confident. I was ready. I was going to go right away and go start flying instruments. So I think that's the ideal level of proficiency that one should shoot for when they're doing their instrument rating. That's not always possible, but I really just want people to understand holistically what is happening when they're doing that instrument rating, which is how I structured my ground school for instrument, because I just feel like it can be taught in a much better way. I've got the simulator behind me, and the last several days I've been doing some time with a helicopter pilot that needs 5 hours for his commercial rating. He's never done any instrument training before. He isn't going to get an instrument rating ever, because he's going to be a police helicopter pilot. They don't fly IFR. And so I was using the simulator as a way to show him just how cool instrument flying was and how great it is, how it all comes together, how the approaches work. And I just think it's really fascinating. I think if we can nerd out on it more and really understand the big picture of what's happening in an instrument, then it works out a lot better. So that's my quick advice, not so quick, is really absorb it and understand it before you move forward. And I think it'll work out better for you. Really simple question. What do you think is the best airplane to train in? The one that is available. Not really, but 172s, Cherokee 140s, bunch of different airplanes. Anyway, lots of different airplanes. Go have fun. Don't overthink it. But 172s are so popular when it comes to flight training. Advice for a young adult wanting to get into aviation. So here's the thing, okay? Aviation is kind of a lifestyle. When you decide to become a pilot and you remain a pilot, you are committing yourself to a lifelong of learning, a life of curiosity, and a life of adventure. And so I think it's almost like a paradigm shift in your life that says, hey, aviation is now going to be part of my life. Now, as part of that, you are going to watch a bunch of YouTube videos. You're going to listen to a bunch of podcasts. You're going to follow people on Instagram. You're going to do all these different things that surround aviation. And as you envelop yourself in that community, you're going to start gaining friends that are in your local area. You can go to local EAA chapters or different AOPA programs, wing programs. Go talk to people at the airport. Just get to know people. You really are entering a community of people that are willing to help, that really enjoy this just like you do. And so it's important to find those that are like you. And I think that social media for me has been very helpful in that way, especially Instagram. I've met so many cool people on Instagram. People I really consider friends now. Like my best friends, almost all my best friends are from Instagram now. That sounds really dumb, but you kind of have a falling out of a lot of high school friends and they move on and do their thing. And then you find that thing you want to do in life. And of course you want to share that with people that are like-minded. So I found a lot of great friends in aviation, and that's just kind of what my life is now. And that's okay. And so my advice would be for someone wanting to get in aviation is just become part of the community and stay a part of the community. Add what you have to the community, and that is how it happens. You'll learn one little thing at a time. You'll learn how to go through your training. You'll have people give you a leg up. You'll give other people a leg up. So it's just one little step after the other until you eventually get to where you're going. Of course, here with what I do, I'm doing this live Q&A today. I give a lot of free advice. Most of my work time is spent on free content, and I'm not the only one that does that. There are so many people out there that do that. So it's a big world out there, and there are lots of great people. So I just admonish you to go out there and work at it and find those people, because it is a great community. Is it common to have to relearn landings in a way when transitioning planes? And absolutely. I think until you've flown just a lot, you really can't do anything different than just like learn to land that specific airplane with that specific sight picture. For me, I feel like I can do pretty good at most airplanes now that I've flown, but I really don't fly anything out of the single engine high wing or low wing category. I don't fly a vast majority of airplanes. And so I think I kind of have it figured out. But yeah, it's absolutely normal to have to learn those new cues in that airplane. That's what helps in having someone help you transition, is they can give you the little things to look for, and then you're off to the races. So absolutely, totally normal. Don't feel like you're in the minority there, because that's definitely normal. Do you recommend doing spin training while doing your private pilot training? I did in my Part 141 program. I don't know if that's a requirement. I did a spin when I was doing that training. I'm a little bit weird on the spin topic because I think that it is a little bit risky. I'm not saying that spins are inherently risky at all, because they aren't. Especially with particular airplanes. You can't spin in just any airplane. But if you know what you're doing and you go up and do a spin, you're going to be just fine. But I just think that those that don't really know what you're doing, like changing the flight category and having the weight in the right location and how to do the recovery and how not to do the recovery and how not to mess with it, I don't know. I think it's a little risky on that end. So I want it to be really vanilla no matter what it is, because I think that the airplanes that should be used for spin training are aerobatic airplanes and things. And so yeah, like if you could do it in an aerobatic airplane and go get some aerobatic experience, absolutely. I think it is important to learn what a spin is eventually rather than just theoretically, but I don't think it's necessarily smart for people to just go up and be doing all that, doing spins all the time. So it really just depends. How do I improve my rudder skills? Use it. Get happy with your feet, okay? Start to play the drums when you're in your car listening to music. This foot, that foot, that foot, that foot. Get used to using your feet and know also what is happening, what you're counteracting for in using your feet. And so we're talking left turning tendencies, we're talking changes in power. All those things are lending to you actually using your feet and keeping coordination. And that's a little bit of thinking ahead. So I've just reduced my power. Okay, I'm going to be adding rudder for that. I'm increasing my power. I'm adding rudder for that. I'm going to the left turn. How much pressure do I add there? How fast am I going? How much pressure should I be adding? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So on down the list, you do need to have a solid knowledge of why you're staying coordinated and what is requiring you to stay coordinated and what changes in the airplane are requiring you to make that change. So that's my big advice there. So how to perfect my landings? I keep floating a little. I might solo this week. If you're pre-solo and you're right there, don't think too much. That's the problem. Don't think too much. Just go through what your instructor taught you to do. Fly instinctually. Usually floating has to do with too much energy, but don't worry about that because I don't know what's going on with you. Your instructor will work that out. You guys will dial things in over time. Just do what you know to do to stay safe and just relax. Have fun. Make sure that you're having fun because that's going to help you relax. And then being relaxed, you can have more fun. And then when you're having fun, you'll be more relaxed. Anyway, it's a vicious cycle or a good cycle. We're talking about a good cycle here. So just relax. You're really early off in your training. And I could go on and on and on about landings and really exhaust you with all my deep knowledge on how to land, but really it's simple at the end of the day. You keep the airplane straight down the runway, you manage your energy with your power, you're on speed and on target with your flaps, and you just fly it on down, hold it off as long as you can, aim a little bit before your touchdown point, you should be good. Here was a good question I wanted to make sure I answered. If you were a fresh CFI, what state would you move to for the best student CFI ratio? I'm in California right now. Seems like flight training is really healthy. Here's the deal. Where the weather is best is where you are going to find the best instructor to student ratio. So that is a good rule of thumb right now. Doesn't mean that flight training isn't hot everywhere. If you have a place you've wanted to live or thought you've wanted to live, there's a chance that instructors are needed there. I did visit the Salt Lake Valley recently, and it seemed like it was pretty rough there. So it's not everywhere, but most places are doing pretty well. So basically, wherever you want to go, everyone is starving for good CFIs right now. So, but chasing the good weather is also something you can look for. Okay, any advice for a 17-year-old wanting to get into aviation? Yes, start right now. You could have got your license at 17 years old. You could have soloed at 16. That's not to say that you're behind. You're absolutely not. I didn't start training until I was 18, but you can start on your written test right now while you're in high school. You can finish that, and then you can be ready for flight training right at 18. Just start. Like, you've got to start. You've got to start moving. You've got to find local airports and interview different flight schools and all sorts of stuff. I have tons of topics on this subject in my podcast, on my YouTube channel. So just start to absorb as much as you possibly can. And then you're going to learn how this process works, and you can go from there. So that's the best advice I can give for someone that's just brand new at this, because I could go on and on and on about the steps you need to take and what you need to do, et cetera, et cetera. But you really just need to start. One good piece of advice, something I kind of do in an official way, is if you go to angleofattack.com, you're going to find the private pilot action plan on my front page. That's like 6 steps in this greatly designed PDF thing that you can download right away that says, here are the things you need to do to start, and gives you a little bit of perspective. That's just a start, and then you can start to expand to YouTube, podcast, these videos, etc., to get going even more. So just keep absorbing and keep moving forward, and you'll find it. Okay. Currently at 11 years active duty Army, do you think I'll have a hope for a career in 9 years? Absolutely. There are plenty of guys who are gals. By the way, your username is cool. Spicy Tuna Roll 33. I had sushi the other night. It was amazing. I want sushi again. Anyway. Yes, doing 20 years in the military and moving on is fantastic. Plenty of opportunities. So earlier someone said, hey, you're going to come fly at Cape Fear. Cape Fear is right next to Fort Bragg. They take a lot of the helicopter pilots that are Fort Bragg, or even just Army in general, and they'll take them through their training. Now you can do that, of course, with the GI Bill. I'm not sure if they call it the GI Bill anymore, but your education, you can do that at a Part 141 program and go through your training that way. The Army, for people that are already aviators, they're paying for them to take certain training, transition, et cetera, et cetera. Airlines will pay for the transition from helicopter to fixed wing. It's crazy. There's lots of opportunities right now, so absolutely you're going to be able to transition. Now that's on the current perspective, right? Because 9 years is a handful of years from now. And so will the pilot market still be hot? I'm not totally sure. It's not going to be too late for you. Like, it's still an industry that needs pilots, and so it's definitely possible. There may not be as many opportunities as there are right at this moment. So yes, at this moment, those opportunities are open. Reevaluate in those number of years, and then see what you can do in between to get there. All right, aviators, thanks for joining today on this episode of Motivation Monday. It was great to have you here. Of course, I think we answered a lot of great questions today and covered some ground that I don't think we've covered before. So that was a lot of fun. Of course, if you are a YouTube viewer, go to YouTube, subscribe, like this, comment, be part of the community, and let's make sure that you don't miss anything again on the YouTube channel. Of course, the best way to do that is to turn on those notifications. If you are a podcaster, someone that listens to podcasts, which I am one of those that listens a lot passively to material now, you can subscribe on iTunes. Spotify is another one. I really like Spotify's interface, and I think the podcast gets picked up almost anywhere. So wherever you're at, I appreciate you guys being here. And of course, if you need anything, you can reach out to me anytime. The best way to do that is through direct messages on Instagram. You can also attempt to email me. I'm not as great at that, but I definitely answer comments on YouTube, and will try to answer your email. So my point is, I'm interested, I'm invested in your success, so let me know how I can help you. Maybe there's a topic that I can share with the community that you're struggling with as well. And yeah, I just hope you guys continue to progress forward, keep pushing forward, keep taking those steps, keep being bold, and working toward your dreams. And if there's anything I can do to help you, let me do it. All right, I'll talk to you guys next time. Until then, throttle on.